joining us from the MENA region or from Europe, and probably good morning to those joining us from North America, which is the case to one of our first speakers. Welcome everybody to this webinar of the Economic Research Forum in Cairo. This is a webinar of the education session for the 26th annual conference of ERF. Let me first introduce myself very briefly. My name is Rana Hindi. I'm an assistant professor at the American University in Cairo, and I'm also a research fellow at ERF. I'm delighted to welcome you all today to this webinar on the theme of education. During this webinar, I will actually be wearing 3 different hats. So the first one would be to chair the session and to make sure to give enough time for each of the presenter, and also to allow enough time for Q&As and comments. I'll also be discussing and commenting on the 4 papers that will be presented today. And finally, because unfortunately the last speaker, Dr. Reham will not be able to join us today for this webinar, so I'll be presenting her paper and commenting on it on the same time. So it is a pleasure to have with us today 3 distinguished panelists who are joining us from actually 3 or 4 different countries, and who are going to present their ongoing work on the theme of education. Each presentation will last around 15 minutes, followed by 5 minutes for the discussion, and then another 5 minutes for Q&As and comments from the floor. We'll make sure to have enough time for Q&As, as I mentioned. So I invite you, please, to share your questions and comments using this chat facility on Zoom at any time during the presentations. You can also use this raise hand on the participants window during the Q&A session, so you can come in and ask your question. Just for your information, this webinar will be recorded by the ERF team and will be and the recording will be available actually on the ERF website and YouTube channel. So now one last thing, I want to ask you to please make sure to mute your microphones to avoid any noises to disturb our presenters. And without further ado, let me present our first speakers. So the first paper is entitled Public Preschool and Maternal Labor Supply in Algeria, the Evidence from a Natural Experiment, co-authored by Caroline Krafft and Moundir Lassassi. Caroline Krafft is an associate professor of economics at St. Catherine University. She has a PhD from the University of Minnesota, and she's a particularly active researcher at ERF. Her research primarily focuses on labor, education, health, and inequality in the Middle East and North Africa. And this paper is co-authored with Moundir Lassassi, who is a researcher and the director of the Human Development and Social Sciences Division at Krafft in Algeria. Moundir has a PhD from the Aix-Marseille School of Economics and the NCA, and he's also a labor economist. So it's a real pleasure to have you both, Caroline and Moundir, today. You have 15 minutes and the floor is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Rana, for this introduction, and thanks for ERF for this invitation and for this organization. So is joint work with Caroline Krafft. This paper, the idea in this paper is to test whether the public preschool implemented in 2008 in Algeria can increase women labor force participation using a natural experiment. So as you know, female labor force participation is at the center of policy discussion around the world, and in particular in the MENA region. in which where female labor force participation rate is very low, among the lowest in the world. Out of 20 countries with the lowest participation rate, 15 are in MENA countries. Very few, very low female labor force participation, despite rapidly raising female education attainment. And here we can talk about Mina Paradox, increasing of education with little effect on female labor force participation. So many empirical studies analyze the determinant of female labor force participation in MENA countries. The most common factors discussed in this paper, first is the role of demographic characteristics and family composition. We can see a lot of papers, mostly of Ragi Assad, Rana Hindi, Sharina Yassin, and other papers. The second point is the conservative gender norms, Islamic culture and social norms, and effect of this conservative gender in participation of female labor force participation. However, little is known about what programs or policies may increase female labor force participation in the MENA region. In particular, there is limited empirical evidence on the effect of child cost and the impact of this cost on women participation in MENA region. The empirical studies analyzing the effect of preschool programs on women participation focus mostly on the case of developing countries and on the case of Latin America. And the public provision of pre-primary has mixed results on female labor force participation. Some studies have found no or little effect from expanding pre-primary school, or only impact on specific groups, both in developing or in developing countries. So we find just 2 papers in the case of our region, MENA region and Africa region, on the case of Mozambique and Kenya, and they find a positive employment effect of subsidies of care. So the aim of this paper is to contribute to this literature on the case of MENA region and to bridge the gap. So the main question is, what will it take to increase women participation? And to answer this question, we test the potential of public preschool to reduce the opportunity cost of women in our region, given their domestic responsibility. Women take more care about care compared to men in our region. And increase their participation using the natural experiment in Algeria. I'm going to present briefly the situation, the education system in Algeria and the labor market characteristic in Algeria. So Algeria is one of the many MENA countries with low female labor participation, estimated at 17.3 in 2015, and the rate increased very slightly over time. We just gap from 10% to 17% in 13 years. Very low female participation despite increases in women education. Algeria had the 4th largest increases in year of schooling from 1980 to 2010, and the recent cohort have achieved gender parity in education in Algeria, and also in other MENA countries as Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan. The second important point in labor market, Algerian labor market, is the role or the importance of public sector. Public sector employment played a key role in Algerian women economic participation. And we find that participation is higher for never married compared to ever married women. This suggests that domestic responsibility, such as care, are key constraint on female labor force participation in our region. So the education system in Algeria is organized in five levels, starting by pre-primary education, which include 2 steps: preschool for 2 years for child aged between 3 and 4, and preparatory education for 1 year for people for child aged to 5. The pre-primary is volunteer. And the goal of pre-primary is to prepare the child to access to primary education. So as I said before, Algeria implemented the preschool program, free preschool program in 2008. The program was tested before in 2005 in a few governorate and extended after 2008 to all governorate. In 2019, more than 79% of people, eligible people, are enrolled in pre-primary education, with some disparities according to governorate. So to answer our question and to test the causality between a preschool program and female labor force participation, we use multiple indicator cluster survey, mixed data conducted in 2006 and 2012. Mixed survey is nationally representative. So for us, the outcome variable, we focus on the impact of pre-primary on female labor force participation, particularly for women with young children. And for covariate, we include a covariate related to child and to women, because we characterize the participation of child in pre-primary education and women in labor force participation. For both, we include location of the household, urban rural residence, and the region. We include 7 dummy of the related to the region, wealth quintile of the household. For children, we include information on children age, mother education, father education, and children sex. For women, we include information on their education, age group, and marital status. We also quantify, and this variable is very important, to determine the participation or not of women in our region, is the presence of children of various age. So we identify various age, 0, 2, 3, 5, 6, 11, 12, 17 by sex. And each class of ages is correspond to age to start each level of education, particularly for 3, 5 age to start pre-primary education. So we use an RDD strategy and exploit policies that set a cutoff date for pre-primary eligibility to identify the fact of the effect of pre-primary on female labor force participation comparing 2006 and 2012. The idea of RDD is that the treatment, in our case preschool, enrollment in the preschool, is determined by some forcing variable. In our case, the forcing variable is the preschool law state that children are eligible only if preschool age of September 7. So RDD model can be estimated parametrically or non-parametrically. We do both in this paper to check the robustness of our results. So for the age cutoff, we have the weeks from the age cutoff at September 7 is our forcing variable. If the birthday date is September 7 or earlier, this value is 0 or positive, and the child can start pre-primary sooner. If the birthday is later in the year than September 7, this value is negative, and the child has to wait until the next school year to start primary education. And since children can start pre-primary and various age, we divide our sample into discontinuity group. We define three groups. The age 3 group, the age 4 group, and the age 5 group. For women, we use the same concept based on the youngest eligible child, and children and women can be only in one group, discontinuity group. So I move to the result. I start with descriptive results. I'm not going to discuss all results, but select some. So the result shows that among women with eligible children, women whose youngest child was enrolled in pre-primary were more likely to be in the labor force and employed compared to women with eligible children or youngest children not eligible to be in the pre-primary education. We also control with some variable: education of mother, age of the mother, marital status, strata of residence, and we find result as expected. More mother is educated, living in urban area, never married woman, living in wealthy family, they increase the probability to be in the labor force, and we find concave relationship, classical concave relationship between participation in labor force and the age. And the age. So an important relationship is visualized in this graph: women labor market outcome by youngest child age. And globally, we can see from this descriptive analysis when pre-primary expanded, women participation did not. So it's clear from this descriptive statistics, but from descriptive statistics we cannot check the significativity of this result. So we do also other statistic descriptive median hours per pre-primary education for per week for youngest child by women labor market status, employed, in employment, and inactivity. So I move to result of discontinuity. So first we start with discontinuity in primary education, and after I will present the result of parametric and non-parametric RDD models. In this graph, we check for various ages, age 3 cutoff, age 4 cutoff, age 5 cutoff, and we compare 2006 and 2011 and 2012, and we can see that for the age 3 cutoff, 4 cutoff, in 2006 and 2012, we cannot see clear discontinuity. We can see a clear discontinuity only for the age 5 cutoff in 2012. So for non-parametric RDD estimation, we can also find this clear discontinuity at age 5 cutoff in 2012, but with negative relationship. We can see this negative relationship in the sense that women participate less in labor force when the child are enrolled in pre-primary school, and this is counterintuitive results. We don't expect, when we start, we don't expect this result. So we expect that pre-primary enrollment in pre-primary will increase the participation of female labor force participation. But we saw in the literature that we don't have a clear results about the effect of enrollment in preschool. So we also ran a linear probability model for female labor force participation, only for when we observe the clear discontinuity for age 5 in 2012. And here we can see that the youngest eligible child above the cutoff is significant, but with negative effect. So it's clear that the relationship is negative. So have children enrolled in preschool don't increase the female labor force participation in the case of Algeria. So I'm going to just to summarize our finding. So we found that expansion of pre-primary actually decreased female labor force participation, particularly for women with children aged 5 in 2012. We explained this counterintuitive result by the fact that pre-primary education in Algeria is a half day. We calculate the median. The median is about 14 hours per week, making it more difficult for women to work than if they use full-day nursery care. So these results are in part conclude with some studies. They show that full-day kindergarten can increase female labor participation. So the originality of our paper is first to study the relationship, the causality between education preschool and female labor for participation in the case of MENA countries, and also is the first paper to show that per day schooling actually reduces female labor force participation. We don't find other paper talking about this, about the design of preschool education and its impact of female labor force participation. So this result is very important and may do to challenging on the and low female labor force participation context in Algeria. They underline the importance of carefully policy design of preschool programs if to increase female labor force participation in low of female labor force participation context. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Moundir. A great presentation, but also for sticking to the time. So let me share my screen. And for that, may I ask you, Moundir, to stop sharing yours? Hello, Moundir? Oh, now it's good. Okay. Great. So I have to say first that it was a pleasure, and I actually enjoyed reading this paper. Not able. Okay, great. So those are my my comments on the paper. I'll try to be very brief in summarizing first what Moundir has presented right now. So this paper investigates the impact of expanding access to early childhood care and education in Algeria on women's labor force participation. The rationale of this paper is to increase women's employment levels through reducing their opportunity cost, given women's domestic responsibility, especially in a country like Algeria, where women are still considered to be the main responsible of this kind of domestic responsibility. So the author here are using an RDD to identify the effect of pre-primary education on female labor force participation. So as Moundir said it very well, actually, there are two types of pre-primary education. One that is the pre-preparatory education, which is 1 year in duration and starts at the age of 5. And then there is the preschool education that is officially 3 years, which is actually very similar to the French education system that I'm familiar with. And this one starts at the age of 3, but maybe 2 years starting at the age of 4 as well. So now for the regression discontinuity comparisons, the author measure pre-primary for children under the age of 6 at the start of the school year, as well as 3-year-old kids at the time of the survey who would not yet have been 3 at the start of the school year. And this is the September 7 date that Moundir was talking about. Yet after doing very quick research, and again, because I'm familiar with at least with the French system that is very similar to the Algerian one, the enrollment into preschool is actually determined by the month of birth. So it actually goes from December 31st of each calendar year being the cutoff date for admissions in pre-primary education. So regardless of the age of the child in September or at the beginning of the school year, the school would rather look at the year of birth, the calendar year of birth. So to give you an example, this is for an admission of a child in school year 2021. So a child that was born in 2017 would go to the first year of preschool, which is in French called the petite section, where this is the first year of preschool, since we have 3 years of preschool. And then a child who has been born in 2016 would go into the second year of preschool. And if one is born in 2015, he would go to the third year of the preschool. So this brings me to my main comment actually on this paper, which is the issue with the cutoff date. So I saw that the authors have done a lot of robustness checks at the end, in the appendix and at the end of the paper. But here the essential idea of RDD is that the treatment is the preschool age and is determined by those forcing variables, which is in this case the cutoff age at September 7. So I was wondering if you were able to test, or you could test for a different cutoff age that would depend on the year of birth of, or the year, the age of the child, sorry, the age of the child at the end of the school year, or depending if this child is accepted or not in the school year, depending on the year of birth. And this brings me actually to the nuts and bolts of implementing an RD design. So here the main assumption is exceeding the age of child, the age threshold, which is 3 in your case, would impact probability of enrollment in pre-primary. The existence of a treatment being a discontinuous function of an assignment variable is not sufficient to justify the validity of the RD design. And actually this jump in the outcome variable at the cutoff age is unusually large compared to the bumps in the regression curve away from the cutoff, which is not enough clear in the graph that is in the paper and that you showed here during the presentation. So this is a reference that I found very useful, and I'm sure you have checked it before, but just in case. And this is one last comment before I give the floor to the Q&As. So for women who have multiple children of varying ages, the authors use the pre-primary status of a woman's youngest eligible child as the measure of whether the children, her children are in pre-primary or not. So I was wondering if you account for the differences in enrollment that might result from the gender, the differences in the gender of the child. So if my youngest child was a boy, and this is why I sent him to a pre-primary school, does that mean that if my second child is a girl, will I send her as well equally? So I understand this is the assumption you make, but I'm wondering to what extent you tested it. Maybe one very last comment. So it's useful to contrast the RD approach with estimation of unconfoundedness. So this approach does not exploit the jump in the probability of assignment. Instead, it assumes that differences between treated and controlled are interpretable as average causal effects. So I was wondering if you could maybe show and motivate these results in the paper or in the appendix. So I'll stop here and I'll open the floor to people who are there who would like to share comments, ask comments, come in, raise your hands. We have time for that. So there, I can see in the chat there are actually, there is actually a question by France Guy. So maybe the solution is flexible working. And another question by Dr. Marwa Omar. You are working on kindergarten for only 1 year. And what about earlier preschool programs and nurseries? There is also another question by Dr. Marwa, who is asking, so you didn't mention the enrollment percentage in private schools, as well as which is really, which one may be useful, which may be useful in this study. So let me go back to Caroline and Moundir, and I'll give you the floor in case you want to respond to any of the questions and comments.
Moundir, do you want to take some of the comments, or shall I?
Moundir, please unmute.
Okay, yeah. So thank you very much, Rana, for your useful comments. So I will respond to two questions, and after my quarter take the other question. So for the private school, so the private school in Algeria for private school start in 2014. Yeah, and for us in this work, we are looking at the program, preschool program in 2008, using two dates, 2006 and 2012. So private school come after. For the moment, we cannot see or analyze the effect of this program. But when we get the recent data in 2018, we can do this, and maybe we will include the impact of public or private school. I agree with you, Rana, about the sex of the first child. I think in our region is determinant. So maybe we can check this, and also we can check if in the household we have disability child. I would say this handicapé, so they can maybe affect the results. For the date of 7 September, this date is fixed by the law. So in our by the law, so we allow to people to child start primary school just at 7 September. After 7 September, they will attend the next year to be involved in the program. So for this, we use this date. Maybe Caroline.
Yes, maybe Caroline, if you would like to add anything.
Sure. To add to the point about September 7th, that's the one that is in the law. The link you shared was for a French school in Algeria, which uses the French system for cutoffs, but that's not what's common, right? That's just for that one particular French school. So that may have created some confusion. And then we haven't looked so much at the nurseries because we're really looking at a specific intervention of expanding pre-primary. That's our policy question. But of course, the nurseries may have some important effects as well that may also depend on their hours of operation and things.
Very good. Thank you so much, Caroline and Moundir. And I'll now move to the second paper entitled The Women Empowering Effect of Higher Education by Ahmed Elsayed and Alina Shirshikova. I hope I'm spelling it right. So Ahmed Elsayed is a senior research associate at IZA, the Institute of Labor Economics in Bonn. Ahmed obtained his PhD in economics from Maastricht University. His main research interests are in labor and development economics, as well as migration. And his co-author, Alina, is also an affiliate of IZA. So it's a pleasure to have you, Ahmed, and this webinar. You have 15 minutes and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Rana. One question, how can we expand the PDF thing, guys? Yeah, here. Very good. So can you see my screen? Good. So as Rana mentioned, so this paper is joint work with Alina Shirshikova, who's a PhD student at Maastricht University. This paper is is mainly dealing with the idea of evaluating the impact of higher education and exploiting the expansion of higher education that took place across several developing countries over the last few decades. The focus here is on Egypt, given that it's one of the countries that witnessed massive increase in higher education over the last few decades. And the topic is important mainly because we all know and we all agree that gender disparities in education still persists in several developing countries, despite the considerable reduction over years. And this pretty much introduces a male bias link between gender disparity in education and GDP. So this graph, for example, shows you that there's a negative correlation between ratio of female to male to female tertiary enrollment rate and GDP per capita, right? And you can change this one actually and introduce anything else that relates to different levels of education between the two genders, and you pretty much obtain the same picture. Why is that? Why this is the case? Why gender disparities still exist? Mainly because of preference for sons that exists across several developing countries. And the reason for this is usually families expect high returns for educating their sons compared to daughters, right? Because the belief is like, my son is going to support me at old age, my daughter is getting married and leaving the household. So I'm going to invest in the education of my son no matter what. Same also applies to the cost, and cost is not necessarily financial cost in terms of money, but also cost in terms of social cost or stigma of sending my daughter away to get education, right? This explains why education policies, even the gender neutral ones, usually benefit girls much more than boys, right? So the situation in Mina, like Moundir referred to, is kind of a paradox. So Mina is a success story when it comes to education. So over the last decades, there has been improvement actually in education and reducing the gender disparity between the two genders, even compared to other developing regions. And this is mainly could be related to the policies that address the education cost, like providing free education, increasing the supply of schools, for example, or changing curriculum in a way that makes it easier for people to achieve diplomas, like finishing education. Also, there are some policies that change the returns to education, right? Something like public employment policy, for example. So if you manage to finish this particular level of education, we guarantee you a job, right? And this actually is a strong incentive for a lot of families to send their kids to education, right? However, as Moundir mentioned, this improvement in education didn't come together with improvement in the economic and social empowerment of women, right? So labor force participation is the lowest in the region compared to other regions, for example. And generally speaking, there's not much evidence on higher education in particular, and its impact on labor force participation. So what we do here is we investigate the impact of higher education on labor market outcomes and marriage outcomes, mainly for women. So for men and women, we look at labor, and mainly for women, we look at the marriage outcomes in addition. And for identification, we exploit the expansion of higher education in Egypt between the 1960s and 70s. The main policy back then was to construct a university in each province, in each governorate, right? These universities are supposed to reduce the cost of attaining higher education for the two genders, but more for women, as I mentioned, because it was difficult before to send your daughter to a bigger city to go and receive education, while it was easy for your son. To do this, we combine data on the time of university opening with government rates, together with individual data on education outcomes, and later on measures of labor market outcomes and social empowerment. What we find in a nutshell is there is a positive impact of higher education expansion. So opening a university in your province increases the probability of getting higher education by about 1.6 percentage points, about 10%. And the impact is mainly driven by women, as expected. So it's a 35% increase. in the probability of getting education. And again, this is explained by the social norms. So now education became easier for you, became cheaper, and basically education came to you instead of you seeking education. And we find and document longer-term positive impact on labor market and marriage outcomes, mainly for women as a result of this. I'm not going to spend too much time on the literature, but actually this paper speaks to three main strands of economic literature. One of them is on the returns to higher education, which is really limited, surprisingly, even in advanced countries. It also speaks to the literature on the gender bias, especially in developing countries, with a strong preference for sons. Usually families invest more in the health, education, all different domains in general on their sons compared to their daughters. And also it speaks to the education policy reforms literature. So the literature that deals with construction of, like expansion of education by constructing schools, for example, or changing the compulsory education, etc. Context is Egypt. For those who are not familiar with the Egyptian education system, so the pre-university education system consists of 12 years, 6 years of primary education, 3 years of preparatory education, and 3 years of general or vocational secondary education. So 6 plus 3, this is the compulsory stage. And then later on, you can choose between the secondary, general secondary, or vocational secondary, right? General secondary is like the main gate for higher education and enrolling at university later. Vocational, you can do this if you are exceptionally good. Before independence in the 1950s, there was only 3 universities in Giza, Cairo, and Alexandria. In our analysis, we are excluding those. So between 1960s and 1970s, during this time, 16 new universities were constructed, one at in each governorate, mostly in the governorates that didn't have before access to higher education institutions. It's worth mentioning that back in the time, public employment policy was in play. So post-compulsory diploma, so if you manage to finish the compulsory education, enroll and finish secondary education at least, you guarantee a job in the public sector. University education is typically 4 years for most of the fields, with the exception of STEM and medicine that takes longer. Education is generally for free, but transportation cost is non-trivial. You have also costs for books, costs to compensate for the low quality of education, plus of course the opportunity cost of going to education instead of working and supporting that. So this map shows you the pattern of university construction during the time. So all those white regions, we do not include them either because they are the bigger cities of Cairo, etc., or places which you didn't have university, right? All the others are places where you have university constructed during the time period 1960 till 1970. The 3 red ones, Ismailia, Boursaid, and Suez, are the war-affected governorates. There was war between Egypt and Israel in 1967 till 1973, and there was a lot of migration, internal migration taking place, so we exclude these 3 governorates. Data sources, we combine data on the exact time of university construction from the Egyptian presidential decree. So the law in Egypt states that for every university, every new university, you have to have an Egyptian, like a decree by the president of the country. Also, we use data from the official webpage of the public university, and we cross-check this against the World Higher Education Database, right? We care more about the time when study in the university started, not the time of construction. And we make sure that this is the case across the analysis. We also use data on education and labor market outcomes from the Egyptian Labor Force Survey, 2006 to 2017. And we use data on marriage and social empowerment from ELMPS 2006 and 2012. As I said, we restrict our analysis to the governorates that got access to higher education during the time period 1968 to 1967. And we limit the analysis to those who ever attended school. So if you are aged 12 to 25. You'll be treated if you are aged 12 to 18 when the university is opened, which means like you are young enough to enroll the university, or You are controlled then if you are older, if you are in the cohort of like the year cohorts 19 to 25. This gives us about 120,000 observations from the Egyptian Labor Force Survey, 86,000 for men, 34 almost for women. For marriage and social empowerment, we have data for about 4,000 women. Outcome variables we're interested in: education, so if you finish university and the total years of schooling. For the labor market, probability of being currently in a paid job, formal job, public job, etc. Working hours and hourly wage. Marriage for women, we are interested in the age of marriage and inter-household decision making, who's making the decision within the household when it comes to the big decisions. And also husband's years of education as a measure of the quality of marriage. The empirical strategy is staggered death and death. So we estimate the impact on education and later on labor market and marriage outcomes for individuals at governed rates R, individual I, governed rate R, and K cohort. This E is a dummy variable that indicates that you are treated if you are, as I said, like if you are in the age group 12 to 18 versus 19 to 25. You have a bunch of controls, and we also control for the governed rate and cohort fixed effects, and we interact those to capture differences within governed rates, right? Yeah. The main identifying assumptions here are that families cannot take strategic decisions in response to the construction of the university, mainly because the decision is taken at a central level, right? The only reaction you can take is to migrate. If you are willing and you expect the university to be open, for example, and you want your daughter or your son to get education, probably you can migrate as a family. So we do a lot of robustness checks actually on this. But generally speaking, the impact will be lower bound if people move for sake of education. And we show that migration is rather limited in our sample. We exclude individuals from more affected governed rates, which witnessed a lot of internal migration. We also did a lot of several robustness checks regarding the place of birth versus place of residence. And we checked the impact of universities in neighboring governed rates, and we didn't find much evidence actually that people move or cross borders from one government to the other to receive education. The more serious issue here is selection at the level of the governed rate. So it could be the case that a policy is introduced in different governed rates for non-random reasons, right? Like, you know, you could start with governed rates that you have higher number of graduates, for example, in the secondary school, or like whatever other observable or unobservable characteristics that necessitates building a university in one particular governed rate versus the other. Also within the governed rate, I mean, a bigger issue would be like people before and after building the university are different, and you know, there's a pattern or something like a trend that that explains differences between the different cohorts that has nothing to do with the university, for example. This speaks against this. So actually, this is this graph just shows you the being treated as an outcome variable regressed on a bunch of characteristics that we have without controlling for the time trend one time, and another time when you control for the time trend and governed rate fixed effects. And here you find that actually there's some differences on observable characteristics. Like, for example, females are more likely to be treated. Urban region explains a part. Also, like secondary education, so regions that have higher share of secondary education, people are more likely to be treated, more likely to be exposed to higher education. All this is expected, but once we are controlling for the time trend and governed rate fixed effects, all these differences on observable characteristics at least disappear. So this shows us, like, you know, what we are doing is at least safe from differences on observable characteristics. To check pre-trends and governed rates, remember the second point about individuals before and after treatment within the same governed rate could be different. To deal with this, we estimate this pre-trend. So we estimate the probability of being educated or receiving higher education on a bunch of dummy variables that equals 1 if the respondent I in region R was L years old when university opened. This means, like, you know, we look at the time window of different cohorts across the time when university was constructed. The omitted dummy here is the age 19. And the assumption here is the effect on people who were of particular age at that time, captured by beta, would be 0 for all those who are older than 18. So all those who are older than 18 were not eligible to higher education. So it's 0, and then it starts to kick in at the age of 19 or 18. So this is the graph of this equation. And here we have men and women. The variable of interest here is the probability to finish university education. And as you see, older cohorts is 0, there's nothing. And then it starts to kick in once the university is opened if you are 18 or younger, right? And the impact is really driven by women. Men, there's a bit of impact, but not that significant, right? As robustness check, we move this 6 years earlier to see actually if there's similar effect. And yeah, as you see, nothing. So it's the causal impact of opening the university.
I'll please ask you to wrap up because you're running out of time.
Perfect, I'm so sorry. Okay, then education outcomes. What we find here is positive impact for everyone, but mainly driven by women, right? Around 11%. And then labor and marriage outcomes, we find positive impact mainly for women on paid jobs, formal jobs, public employment, and a little bit of positive impact on hourly wages for men. Marriage outcomes from ELMPS, we find positive impact on husbands' education years and inter-household decision making. So the conclusion so far is there are positive effects of university construction and university enrollment and finishing higher education, especially among women in Egypt. And there's long-term positive impact on labor market and marriage outcomes. Next steps would be looking at the role of different areas of study, and actually we find more positive impact for STEM education compared to other fields, and then expand the exercise to other countries and creating kind of a global database of different countries. I'm done. So sorry for taking long. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. I'll please ask you to stop sharing your screen. Great. Okay, so now I'll try not to take much time because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions for you, Ahmed. So this paper analyzes the effects of expansion of higher education infrastructure during the 70s, which I found really a very interesting topic, especially for the case of Egypt. And the authors here are treating university construction as a natural experiment. Here, the authors, as Ahmed just mentioned, they find that the expansion of higher education led to a large increase in the probability to get a university degree for women, and a rather modest effect of the improved university access for men. Also, it has a positive impact on women participation that increased and went up by 20% and 28% in the case of public sector employment. And on the other hand, the authors found no effect of the policy on labor outcomes for men. So now moving to my comments. Great. So the authors employ cross-sectional data from 2009 to 2016. And as Ahmed mentioned, they did bring out this internal migration from urban to rural to access, or rural to urban, to access better quality education. So this issue, in my opinion, it was raised by the authors in the paper, but it was clearly mentioned, but I don't think it was tackled towards the analysis of the paper and took into account. So I'd love to hear more from you, Ahmed, on that issue. Also, the girls could also continue residing in the same governorate as their birth one during their university years, but still access a university in a near governorate. And when I wrote this, I was thinking basically of a girl who is living in Qalyubaya or Giza, and those are governorates that are very close actually to Cairo, and who usually can access very easily Cairo University, for example. So I do understand that you take this into account at some point in the paper, but one constraint may be that the labor force surveys, the Egyptian labor force surveys, do not allow information about the university name or governorate. So also would be great if you can elaborate on that. And because I don't want to take more time, that's one thing that I'm personally very interested to learn about, and that you mentioned at the end of your presentation, which is the field of study. And you mentioned very quickly that you found more positive impact for STEM fields. So I'm very interested. This was not showed in the paper. I do understand it's a work in progress, but please, if you can tell us more about this finding, because I couldn't find it in the paper. I'll stop here. And before I give you back the floor, Ahmed, let me check if there are comments or anyone from the attendees who would like to ask a question. Okay. So please feel free to raise your hands and write in the chat. Okay, Caroline.
Hi, I just had 2 comments. I found this very interesting, and I really wanted to encourage you to try to document the results on mobility and also distance. At least in the ELMPS, I know there are questions about the gender role attitudes towards mobility. So there should be something you can do there to sort of document that potential mechanism. And also, I'm not as sure for the LFS, but in the ELMPS, you have the location of birth or residence down to the Shieka level. So you really could get more on the distance from the university that was built. And I think that would be very interesting to add that as well.
Thank you, Caroline. So don't have to use your real hands like Caroline did, but you can use the raise a hand facility here on Zoom if you have any question, or write them on the chat, please. So I'll go back to Ahmed. Please come in and if you'd like to respond to some of the questions.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rana, and thank you, Caroline, for your comments. So regarding internal migration, one of the issues we have in the labor force survey is that across all the waves, you have data on the place of residence, but not the place of birth. Only in 4 waves, you have a place of birth plus the place of residence. And we use this actually as a process check, and we find pretty much similar impact, especially. And also there, we have questions on the reason of migration in case you migrated. First of all, internal migration across Egypt is really surprisingly low, right? Which is counterintuitive. I was really surprised. Also, the share of people who reported that they have, because they asked you about the reason why you moved. Those who stated that they moved because of education is less than 1%. So actually, I don't think actually migration here is a big thing. Related to this, residing in Al-Ubaya and getting education in a neighboring governorate, this is something actually we have worked on, and we have a similar graph, which I didn't manage to show, that shows actually this is not the impact. Of course, it increases. So actually, if I live in a governorate and then there is a next governorate that witnessed university opportunity, open the university, the chances are higher that I get higher education, but not as much as within the local constraints of my government. But we do something about this. Regarding the field of study, I mean, I'm so much excited about this, and unfortunately I didn't have the time to present it. What we do in ELPS, labor force survey, is they ask people about the field of study. What we do is we go into the website of each university and check actually, because universities, when they are constructed, they're not constructed right away, right? So you construct, for example, a school of medicine first, and then, I don't know, school of, economics later, et cetera, et cetera. So we make use of this to see actually variation in the timing if you are exposed to a STEM field versus non-STEM field. And we find actually girls within those who are treated, within those who received higher education anyway, or within those who are exposed to higher education, those who were exposed to STEM education by the time are more likely to, I forgot actually in which domains, but there was like improvement in their labor market outcomes, in several of their labor market outcomes. For men, as far as I remember, there was a little bit of increase in the wage and the probability of being enrolled in high quality occupation, right? So this is actually the finding of this. Regarding Caroline's points, thank you, Caroline, on the mobility thing. Actually, this is something actually, as far as I remember, we have tried a lot with the distance and stuff. I guess, yeah, we can do some work there. No, with the distance, I'm talking about the distance. With the mobility as a measure of freedom of mobility as a measure of empowerment of women, we can also include this one. Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Ahmed. And I'll now move to the third paper entitled The GMM Approach for an Explanation of the Fertility Change Upward in Tunisia by Olfa Frini. So Olfa is an assistant professor at the Higher Institute of Accounting and Business Administration of Manouba University in Tunisia. And Olfa has a PhD from the University of Cergy-Pontoise. Her main research areas are labor and human development. It's a pleasure to have you, Olfa, in this webinar. You have 15 minutes for your presentation. The floor is yours. Olfa, please make sure to unmute your voice, your microphone.
Yes. So thank you. So my research seek to explain the fertility change upward in Tunisia by a GMM approach. As you can see, is what's the problem? I don't know what's the problem. As you can see by the mean of this diagram, Tunisia, after finishing the demographic transition at the early of 2000s and when launching the model regime, it has recorded an increase of fertility instead of a steady decrease as predicted by the demographic theory. More clearly, we can look at this figure of fertility evolution during 2000 and 2017. Fertility after reached less than two children per woman in 2002, it has steadily increased to reach 2.46 in 2014 and stabilized at 2.33 children per woman in 2017, like the Western country experience, but like some Arab countries as Algeria and Egypt. So such evolution of fertility leaves us wondering whether fertility will keep it rise and what are the causes of this rise. Until now, no clear and convincing explanation have been advanced. So, for instance, Colbage 2015 believed that this fertility behavior change has been caused under the pressure of Arab Spring Revolution. However, he overlooked that it has been observed long before, for instance, since 2006 in Tunisia. So this fertility change deserves more deep explanation and understanding about its causes. For that aim, the paper target is to give some light at this current and unexpected demographic issue in Tunisia. So for that, we revisit the mean fertility decrease determinant picked out by the previous studies as contraception, marriage, education, employment during the post-transition period in order to inspect if they do no longer influence fertility downward. So we re-examine the interaction education-fertility to check if education does no longer play its role in reducing fertility as strongly acclaimed by Bika and as proved in the previous work on Tunisian case. Moreover, we explore new socioeconomic factors that is likely to favor fertility rise in line of Eastern approaches such as divorce, employment, and longevity. So for theoretical discussion, we theoretically demographic transition describe a move in demographics from high birth and death rate, which is called traditional demographic system, to low rates. A new equilibrium is established by the modern demographic regime, where population continues to grow very slowly. Mortality and birth rates are at low level. By the literature overview of the causes of the fertility transition, we could quote the mortality drop according to demographer. However, basing on Beaker studies, it's related to education, more explicitly to quantity-quality trade-off and time-cost hypothesis. But referring to Liebenstein, it is due to economic and social development, focusing on social influence group. According to Easterlin, it is explained by the preference change and fertility regulation, but in contrast to Caldwell, fertility transition is mainly explained by the reversal of intergenerational wealth flow. Now, the question is, what is the potential reliable factor of this fertility rise observed in Tunisia? To find them, we have looked at the evolution of the mean factor that have assisted to the Tunisian demographic transition process. We have remarked that they become underperforming to keep fertility at low rate in the post-transition. More explicitly, we have observed a looseness of fertility control by the National Board for Family and Planning and stability of contraceptive prevalence. So it is about 60% during more than decades. There is 3 main reasons. The first one is a change in the NFP population strategy directed to the health problem and disease sexually transmitted. The second, the medical staff and manager motivation is in conflict with that of ONFP. In fact, they attempt to discourage women to control birth using model and religious argument. There is a slight return to the religion's principle, which disturb the society perception, as argued Corbage. And third reason is the recurrent shortage of contraceptive device supply. So the second cause of the increase of fertility is the increase of marriage for more than decades. The rate passed from 40% to 20% during 2004 and 2014, while the decrease of the celibacy rate from 42% to 36%. As well, a slow education development, reflected by the increase of illiteracy rate and an increase of the school dropout rate, which reached 10%. In addition, there is an increase of divorce, which rate has doubled. In fact, divorce may affect fertility by 2 ways. By inputting in hand of an additional birth toward decline, but as well by promoting an additional birth after establishing a new family towards an increase. The question is then, does divorce have increased fertility? Besides, with longevity gain, there is an increase of the birth at advanced age group, for instance, 45 years old. In fact, women living more longer are encouraged to have an additional child at late age in order to rejuvenate her couple life, and given they are more likely to take care of their children at the end of their fertility cycle. In addition, with longevity gain, couple could benefit of their aging parents' attendance if they are in good health, notably of their child care service, generally for free, or of their financial support, what favors the revising upward of fertility, as found in our previous published work in 2014. Finally, the enduring and high unemployment, notably for women, 22% during 2014 and 2018, and reached 41% for high educated women in 2017. In fact, this pushes the women to marry and to have children since their time cost opportunity is low. So in light of this Tunisian context and basing on the literature review, we specify a fertility model where overall fertility is explained by mortality, education, primary and secondary female enrollment number, and income, which is approximated by the household electricity consumption due to unavailability of data, and the contraceptive use to examine the motivation of birth control and to indirectly estimate the NFP function and regulation effort. So besides this traditional variable used frequently in the previous studies, we introduced 3 new socioeconomic factors which constitute our novelty and contribution, which are defaults, birth expectancy life, and unemployment. So the model of overall fertility is as follows. Then to assess empirically the long-run fertility behavior, we apply the dynamic one-step generalized method of moment, the GMM, on 3 models. The first model, which constitutes the reference model, where there is only the traditional variable. Then we introduce alternatively the 3 new variables. Only when in the model 2, we introduce divorce and unemployment. But in the model 3, we introduce the birth expectancy life then we pass to the panel, our panel, which is constituted with 8 Tunisian regions. The period is over 1997 and 2017. So the number of observation is 152. There is a cylindrical panel, and our data source are the Tunisian National Institute of Statistics. So the mean statistical characteristic of these used variable are summarized by this table. Generally, variables are not correlated as demonstrated by this matrix correlation. So the estimation put forward, thanks to the Sargan statistic test, the p-value validate the instrument used, and the test of a Landau test found out the presence of one effect IL1 and an absence of second-order autocorrelation. Now our findings generally confirm our presumption since all variables present the expectancy. We note a positive impact of the fertility delayed value with 1% significance level. For the traditional variable, they are no longer play the reducing role, as we can see here. All the coefficients are not significant. Only for electricity, we have a positive and significant coefficient. This explains the reducing effect of this classical variable, so which lead to this the rise of fertility. So this created our prediction, and the 3 new variable explain significantly the rise of fertility. We have a positive and significant coefficient for our 3 new variables. In conclusion, we could advance that fertility change toward the rise is mainly due to the lack of the reducing factor influence. In detail, family planning program no longer plays its role as seen at its creation, namely the birth control. The negative interaction education fertility is no longer obvious. The income effect dominates the substitution one to favoring fertility increase. And our 3 new variables, not considered in the previous studies, divorce, employment, and longevity, act in favor of fertility increase. So finally, fertility decision is more directed by the social and cultural factor to play more to Estonian approach than to Beaker one. As a policy implication, we invite authorities to revise their population strategy and orientation to consider the familial network interference in family planning program settlement, and the UNFP must revive its family planning role and seek to better disseminate the contraceptive method device. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Olfa, for this presentation. May I ask you to please stop sharing your screen so I can open my comments?
Okay.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so of course, this is a very interesting topic. I know that also some of the panelists on this webinar have also worked on similar topics. So I know for a fact that Caroline has wrote a very similar paper on Egypt, trying to explain this sudden increase in fertility in Egypt after the revolution. Just to summarize what Olfa just said, this paper investigates the increasing fertility trend in Tunisia from less than 2 children per woman in 2002, and that rose to 2.46 in 2014. Olfa aims to re-examine the education-fertility interrelationship to seek whether education does no longer play its role in reducing fertility. The author explores 3 new socio-economic factors, namely divorce, unemployment, and longevity, and she uses a GMM method as presented, and her findings actually confirm that the 3 variables, divorce, unemployment, and longevity, have all of them have positive effect on fertility, and that education-fertility interaction is no longer obvious. Family planning program appears no longer playing its role in Tunisia. And my main comment on this paper is actually the endogeneity of some of the variables used here. And maybe I tried to look in the paper for a detailed discussion of those instruments that you talked about in the presentation, but that was unfortunately missing, at least in the version. I know that was not the updated version of the paper, probably, but in the version of the paper that was sent to me earlier. So I'll stop my comment here. It's mainly about endogeneity then that I'd like to hear from you, Olfa. But before I go back to you, let me check if in the chat or maybe if anyone from the attendees or the panelists would like to ask a question or make a comment on the paper. Caroline, would you like to come in?
Well, you alluded to my past work on this, so I'll mention that particularly. Yes, we looked for Egypt at why fertility had sort of picked back up, and one of the hypotheses I looked at was maybe the reduction in employment opportunities for women was part of that. And there is a lot of evidence in the MENA region that there's this sort of collapsing of the education gradient in fertility. Traditionally, there's a very strong education fertility relationship, but the MENA region has really seen that collapse down, possibly due to fewer employment opportunities for women. So we see that in Egypt and some work in Jordan. I'll email you the papers so you can see those.
Thank you so much, Caroline. So back to you, Olfa.
So for the problem of endogeneity, in fact, as you know, we are a Muslim country, so we use contraceptive after marriage. Generally, for our Muslim country, we have to have birth and to use contraceptive is after in the context of marriage. So the decision to use this contraceptive come after the decision to have children or not. Because when we decide to marry, indirectly we have the notion to have children. So when we decide to use contraception, it come after the first decision. So the endogeneity is not very strong, notably for the Muslim countries. So in our previous work, we have tested the age marriage decision as a mean of birth control. Because in Muslim countries, to legitimate the birth, to explore the fertility cycle, we have to pass to take the decision to marriage. So when we take this decision, so we pass after that to take the decision to practice or not contraception, and not before. So I think it is less strong, less significant, this problem of endogeneity in Arab and Muslim countries. Just this.
The thing is that the use of contraception in the literature has known to be or is usually used as a proxy or as an instrument for fertility. So this is why I was worried that here, you're looking at fertility and you're trying to explain fertility, and then you have contraception on the other hand of the equation. Anyways, that's a discussion that we can complete later. Would you like to add anything, Olfa, before we move to the last presentation?
No, that's enough.
Very good. Thank you so much. I think I will have to share my screen again. But before that, the last presenter for this webinar is Reham Rizk. She was supposed to be here to present her paper entitled "Do Parents Compensate or Reinforce Child Ability Gaps with Evidence from Egypt Using Private Tutoring." So Reham Rizk is an associate professor at the British University in Egypt and is currently the head of the Forecasting and Modeling Unit at the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development. Reham's research primarily examines labor issues with a focus on education, health, and inequality. So I'll have to share my screen again to present Reham's work and follow the presentation by my comments. Okay. Great. So the motivation of Reham's paper is that there are natural differences in children's initial endowments and cognitive abilities. And she tries to answer the question of how parents respond to these differences. So the research question here is to assess the parental investment responses to siblings' ability gaps in Egypt. Who compensates, who reinforces?
Sorry for interruption, but you're still showing the presentation by Olfa? Maybe I'm wrong, or?
Sorry, can you see
the screen still? Oh no, now I see it. I'm so sorry. So it's probably my computer, which is late. Okay, thank you.
Okay, let me try to go back to the full screen. Great. So the research question of this paper is to assess the parental investment responses to siblings' ability gaps in Egypt. So basically, Reham is trying to see whether parents tend to invest more, both financially and non-financially, in children who are more able to return this investment later, or do parents tend to equalize between siblings regardless of their abilities? So the literature here, interestingly, shows that parental investment in children could have three main directions. So the first one is the one that tend to reinforce, which means that the marginal returns to investment is higher when the child is of higher ability, and that parents in this case direct financial and non-financial resources enabling children to maximize returns to investment. The second branch of the literature rather focuses or tend to support the hypothesis of equity rather than efficiency. And in this case, or in this branch of the literature, parents seek to compensate and equalize gaps in children's outcome, so they divert more resources to less endowed children. And lastly, or the third branch of the literature is just saying that there is a neutral effect. So neutral effect is found about child endowment differences and parental investment. Also the literature shows that socioeconomic and demographic factors could shape the investment strategy that parent can follow. Now, Reham in this paper is using data from the Egypt labor market panel survey. The sample is restricted to only 2 siblings who completed primary education and who are observed in at least one round of the ELMPS. The sample consists of 950 siblings from 450 households. Okay, so here is the model that is estimated in this paper. So Reham is estimating an ordered probit model where the dependent variable or the outcome variable of child I in household J is measured as the difference in investment outcome between index child and the other sibling. And it takes 3 possible values. The independent variable is a vector of child level, sibling, and family characteristics. So here, to measure the school investment of parents in their children, the author uses expenditure on private tutoring as a fraction of family income. And the key control variable of interest for the author is then the primary score of the focal child, also this index variable that denotes the child's primary score as a measure of the own endowment. And it is a binary variable that is equal to 1 if the sibling has a higher primary score and equals to 0 otherwise. The author also controls for the child's age and gender, and also controls for a bunch of parental and household characteristics. Okay, so those are the main findings, but let me move directly to the summary of results here. So basically, the author finds that parents' investment in the case of Egypt acts as a net equalizer between siblings, which means that parents tend to equalize, to invest equally in their siblings, regardless of their ability, regardless of the returns to this investment later. Another interesting finding in this paper is that mother's education seem to be very significant or significant in all the estimations, which was kindly expected, but it's good to see it confirmed. Higher tutoring investment in favor of female students, which means that within the household, parents apparently, or that's what the findings show, that parents tend to invest more in female students rather than compared to males, which is very interesting, especially for the case of Egypt to find this. And also a similar finding in the case of younger siblings that seem to get more investment than older ones. Okay, so now I'm done with the presentation of the paper. I'll move directly to So I'll skip this. This summary that I prepared. I'll move directly to my discussion. So according to the literature, there are important factors that seem to affect private tutoring in Egypt. So the literature talks about the type of school, private or public, parental and socioeconomic characteristics, of course, which was accounted for by the author, the number and the gender of children. This again was accounted for by the author. Also, another thing that one can think about and the literature brings out is the time spent by one or both parents on childcare and education, the family size, and also the region of residence. So what you can see on this slide in blue are those factors that are actually important when we look at when we try to understand, or when we look at private tutoring in Egypt, but that were not accounted for in the study. So that was actually my first comment, is that especially that information about the type of school, whether the school where the child is enrolled is public or private, this is an information that we have in the ELMPS data. So I wanted to highly encourage the author to include this in the study, in this dimension. Would also be helpful to consider families with more than 2 children, because the author here restricts the analysis to families with 2 children and found this equalizing effect. But I would say that if we look at bigger families, larger families in size, so families who have 3 or 4 children, we might find different results in that case. So this can be a way to test for the robustness of the neutrality hypothesis here. Now, more problematic, in my opinion, is the idea of measuring or considering the private tutoring as a proxy for parents' investments in their children, in the quality of their children, right? And this is actually something that the author brings out in the paper, in the beginning of the paper, where she mentions that private tutoring is in some cases at least the only source of education to compensate for the very low quality of education, especially of public education. So considering private tutoring as how to say it, as a positive thing, or as a way of investing in education, is, my opinion, very problematic. And I would have loved to have Dr. Reham with us on this webinar to respond to these comments, but at least I will invite you panelists and participants to please still ask your questions and make your comments, since this will be recorded and the author will be able to check it later. So I'll stop here and I'll go to, I'll open the floor for any questions or comments. Anyone would like to come in, maybe to ask a question for on the last paper?
Okay. I have a question. So probably I've missed this in the presentation, but is there has Reham documented differences across the 2 genders, for example, when it comes to compensation for my son versus my daughter, etc., and also, like, you know, the birth order, like if I have an older son but a younger daughter and vice versa, if there are implications for this or not?
Yes, for the gender, she does actually find a positive effect for females. So which means that a parent that has a girl and a boy would invest more in the girl's education than the boy's education. And that was the interesting result I was talking about. But I didn't see, at least in the paper that was sent to me, I didn't see anything about the order the child. So that's definitely something that could be taken into account. But again, I'm not able to answer more questions on the paper, but please go ahead and ask the questions anyway, so the author can check them afterwards. Okay, so in case there are no further questions, so let me then thank you all very much. I think we will wrap it up. I think we're doing a very good job on time. I would like to thank the ERF team, Shireen Hunaim, Huda Azmi, Namis Nabil, and all the ERF family for organizing this webinar and for giving us the chance to still have this session on education, despite everything that was taking place in the past few months. Thank you all speakers, and thanks to all our participants for joining us and for your question. Thank you so much, everyone. Stay well and safe, everybody, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.